Many long books of weighty words and many volumes in them have been dedicated to talking about humanism, so obviously I can't do full justice to explaining this view of the world, this way of living, this philosophy of life, this approach to values and meaning in just 5 minutes. So I want to say 3 things very briefly, just to give you some of the typical attitudes that are associated with a humanist worldview, which is the view of the world that the BHA, the British Humanist Association, promotes and supports people who have. I'm going to say something about reality, something about morality, and something about meaning. Start with something about reality. I think it's pretty fair to say that, broadly speaking, across the whole history of human thought, as long as men and women have looked around and said, what is this sort of place that we're inhabiting? What is going on here? What is this stuff all around us? What is it made of? How does it work? And questions like that. There have been 2 sorts of answer to those questions. There have been people in almost every time and every place who have looked around them and said, this is not all there is. This crude material reality that we perceive is just the screen in front of some greater reality beyond it that we can approach and touch through dreams or gods or demons or angels or some other means. And then there's been another way of looking at the universe. People who have said, this that we see and that we perceive with our senses is reality. There is no second layer to the universe. And we can understand reality by our observation, by our intellect. And 2 things really arise out of that conviction to convey sort of briefly now. One is the idea, in consequence of that view of reality, that human beings can understand the universe that we inhabit, that it is possible to approach some meaningful knowledge about the world in which we find ourselves, that the universe is comprehensible. And the other attitude that arises from this idea about reality is that far from being some separate creation that is not connected with the rest of the universe but is somehow apart and aside from it, people who take this view of reality acknowledge that human beings are very interconnected with the world in which we find ourselves and which nourishes us and the universe that we were born into. Now, it's obviously this latter view of reality which is the one that typifies a humanist approach. So that's what I want to say about a humanist attitude towards reality and making sense of the universe. Something about morality. Again, there have been 2 broad ways in the history of human thought of thinking about morality, what it is, where it comes from, and what it consists of. One view has it that morality is something that came to us from outside, that at some point struggling and suffering and brutal and bestial human beings suddenly had gifted to them principles for living, that until this point they were read in tooth and claw, and after this event, this historical event, when these commandments were issued on tablets of stone or in some other form, miraculously they were redeemed from themselves and able at last to live in some sort of cooperative way. And obviously those sorts of views of what morality is go hand in hand, usually with the idea that morals equals rules for living to be followed, that the test of whether something is right or wrong is whether or not it approximates to this pre-existing rule or commandment. Another way of looking at morality, which is the way that typifies a humanist approach to these things, is to say morality is not something that came from outside of human beings. When we look at our close relatives in the animal world, we can see all the sorts of behaviors and instincts that lie at the foundation of what we as conscious animals today call morality. Morality is something that comes from inside human experience. And on this view, you can see very quickly that the consequence is that far from being embodied in rules and commandments that we have to obey from the outside, morality is a sort of sympathy with other human beings. It's generated by our interactions. It's about seeing yourself in the face of the other person and respecting them for the same reasons that you respect yourself. Reason and empathy and thinking about the best way to live are the consequences of this view of morality. It's at this point that you realize that 5 minutes was far too optimistic a limit to put on an explanation of humanism when you're only 2/3 of the way through. The third circle in our Venn diagram, the third thing I want to say something about, is meaning. There's a view of the meaning of life that has it that purpose is out there waiting to be discovered, that you search around the universe, you study hard the trajectory of reality, the patterns that you find around you, and in there you can discern meaning, purpose, intention. Reality is going somewhere. Out there is some sort of cosmic knitting pattern around which everything coheres and by which everything is mandated. And if you search really hard and try all your days, you might eventually, Indiana Jones-like, discover at the end of your quest in a locked chest deep in a cave the meaning that you have been searching for, and it was there all the time, if only you'd known it. That's not the view we associate with the humanist attitude. The view that we associate with the humanist attitude is that meaning is not something out there waiting to be discovered, but something that we create. That we create meaning and a sense of purpose in our own lives, that we're the ones who ascribe meaning to the experiences that we're having. These ideas found in combination can be discerned pretty much everywhere that there have been human communities writing down their thoughts. You can find them over 2,500 years ago in India, over 2,500 years ago in China, over 2,500 years ago in Europe, and of course they're all over the world today. And today we call this approach to life humanism. Almost 5 minutes. 5 minutes, give or take. So the next part of my talk is the part where I talk about an aspect of humanism related to the theme of the Ancestor's Trail. Last year, this was extremely easy. I talked about evolution and the way in which the discovery of the theory of evolution plugged an intellectual hole in a humanist approach to understanding life, which had hitherto seemed unpluggable. This year, as you've heard, the theme of the Ancestor's Trail is the year of the amphibian. Plastic and comprehensive as a humanist worldview is, and of course all-encompassing, it is very hard to find something relevant to say about the year of the amphibian from a humanist point of view. So instead, I'm addressing a slightly smaller question. I'm going to talk about the meaning of life. Humanism and the meaning of life. So let's think about this topic instead, together for a little while. And as we drift through it in a slightly rambling way, maybe we'll find points of intersection with, if not the specific theme of Ancestor's Trail, then the more general themes of diversity and community and belonging and the interconnectedness of living things and other useful abstract terms that I can anchor myself to in the next 20 minutes. This weekend is all about our kinship with the rest of nature and with the animal world in particular. And of course, we know that many of the things that we used to think were uniquely human, we've now discovered are really just aspects of experience along the spectrum of which we are at the far end. You know, we no longer delude ourselves that we are the only animals capable of forward planning and the use of tools and moral sentiment and so on and so forth. We see ourselves instead, quite properly, as being on one far edge of a spectrum of those sorts of behaviours. But the conscious attribution of meaning to experience and the spending of time in trying to explore the question of why we're here, where we're going, what we're doing, and how we should live, is a very human endeavour. For a humanist, though, from a humanist point of view, as my short definition of humanism hopefully made clear, there isn't actually any meaning of life in the way that this phrase is conventionally used. There's no indication in our universe of some higher external purpose for our existence of which human beings are part. So instead, what humanists have tried to do is to sort of try and salvage the phrase by redefining it. And here's a good example of a sort of redefinition. Don't worry, I'll read it out to you. You can keep drinking. By Karl Popper, humanist philosopher and philosopher of science. He makes a pretty good attempt at redefining into relevancy this phrase, the meaning of life. He says the phrase is sometimes used in the sense of a deeper hidden meaning, something like the hidden meaning of an epigram or of a poem. But the wisdom of poets and philosophers has taught us that the phrase can be understood in a different way, that the meaning of life may not be something hidden and perhaps discoverable, but rather something with which we ourselves can endow our lives. Now, I think that's a pretty good attempt, in theory, to redefine this phrase so that it is meaningful and useful. But in practice, rather than speak usually of the meaning of life, or even of meaning in life, humanists have tended to talk of how we should live, of living well in the one life that we have. And that sort of talk is guided obviously by a few humanist convictions. Acceptance of the finite nature of the human person in time has consequences for the question of how we live and what meaning we might give our lives. This life is not just an episode in our existence, it is our entire existence. We're never going to develop further as persons than we will develop in this life. There's no future time in which our completion can occur. And so the development of the whole person and the search for the answer to the question of how best to live has an added urgency for humanists. And in consequence, it tends to shift our thinking away from the meaning of life to talk instead of the good life. What is the good life? How should we live in this life? Not looking for purpose beyond and outside, but within our experience of the existence that we have. Now, a phrase like the good life immediately meets objections. People will tend to say, critical and just not necessarily hostile critics, but friendly critics at this point will tend to say, well, it's all very well talking about the good life, but for most people this sort of thing isn't available. Human life is not just good, it's not just a case of the pursuit of nice ways of being, interesting personal development and fulfillment. Actually, a huge amount of human life is full of tragedy. There are people today who have painful, incomplete and worthless lives and always will have, and that is how they were born and how they will die. And the most graphic embodiment of that truth for us today is probably, I think, for all of us we would accept, the sort of global inequality that we live with. It's clearly the case that there are those of us who are going to live out our lifespan of 100 years in comfortable Western affluence, using our leisure time to probe the interesting questions of reality and life, perhaps pushing back the boundaries of science in ways that never before have been dreamt of, countless opportunities for personal growth and feelings of completeness. And there are those of us born just a few days ago who won't live out the week through famine or disease or whatever. And it's a legitimate challenge, which I'm not going to answer or explore to any great depth now because I haven't got time, and partly because I don't know the answer, but I leave it with you. It's an interesting challenge in light of that, whether the humanists talk in a universal sense of human flourishing and the good life is really possible. Many humanists say it is. And they go further and say that actually acknowledgement of the tragedy that we find in our life is sort of the functional basis for compassion in human beings. Richard Norman, who's a humanist philosopher, makes a sort of virtue of this in a way. He says, the human condition is one of vulnerability. Our fate may be terrible and there may be no consolation. To recognize fragility is to accept that we are vulnerable to circumstances. But these are grounds for sober realism, but not for despair. The ideal to which we can aspire is not a remote, non-human ideal. It is one which is formed from our experience of what human beings are capable of at their best. It is an ideal that comes from within our own humanity. So acknowledgement, in a sense, of our universal human tragedy for humanists does provide that functional basis for compassion. And the humanist answer to the question of whether we can speak of human experience in a universal way faced with this inequality is in someone like Richard Norman's mind, at least, that we not only we can, but that we must. Like I say, that's a question I leave with you. If then we're talking about the good life, the way to live, how should we live now? What should our lives be for in this sense? Again and again, of course, in the last 2,500 years, the idea that has persisted and risen repeatedly is that the aim of life, therefore, should be the pursuit of happiness. This is the overarching aim in an individual human being's existence. Now, this idea can be made to seem crass, selfish, base, sterile, and it's always needed defending. This is a defense from over 2 millennia ago, from Epicurus, of this idea. When I say that pleasure is the goal of living, I do not mean the pleasures of libertines. I mean the pleasure that consists of freedom from bodily pain and mental agitation, not the product of one drinking party after another, or sex with women and men, or seafood. It's a great his historical context, this is a rare and great gourmet pleasure at the time. So where were we? Sex with women and men, or seafood, the eating of seafood, and other delicacies. On the contrary, the pleasure that is the result of clear thinking. Now, these words of Epicurus really illustrate how timeless the critiques of the pursuit of happiness as libertinism are, and they also provide a defense of this idea of the pursuit of happiness as being a key ingredient of the good life. And humanists today typically are echoing Epicurus's attitude, even if they're not doing so knowingly. Pleasures of the flesh and seafood are obviously an important part of a good life, and pointless self-denial is obviously going to be avoided by anyone who doesn't think it's sinful. Physical sensation is a pleasure in itself and a stimulus to other pleasures, and the enjoyment of all these things fit into this category. Equally, however, the point that Epicurus is making, pleasure comes from creativity, from relationships with others, from intellectual endeavor, and a plethora of other sources. So, when I talk about the pursuit of happiness, when anyone talks about the pursuit of happiness as the aim of a good life, of a good way of living, don't be misled into thinking it's just the pursuit of pure sensation. It's also the pursuit of personal development. Once life is well underway and 2 or 3 decades have gone by or more, it's 2 or 3 decades in my case, the introspective human being, of which you are all examples, is conscious of his or herself as a complex personality, as someone who has developed, as someone who has an existence that has changed with time, become more complex over time as a result of their experiences, tissues of experience and of meaning self-ascribed. A humanist view on the question of how we should live calls attention to this truth about the human person, and proceeds from this really to encourage more conscious self-development. And this is a good example of this from John Stuart Mill. And it's interesting to think that he is of as it were, the Darwinian generation. John Stuart Mill's great book on liberty was produced in 1859, the same year as On the Origin of Species. So we're sort of swimming in the same intellectual currents, is my attempt to link these 2 topics together to the theme of the weekend. John Stuart Mill, in proportion to the development of his individuality, apologies, his or Victorian, his or her individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. There is a greater fullness of life about his own existence, and when there is more life in the units, there is more in the mass which is composed of them. So this idea of personal development has been very important in humanist responses to the question of how we should live. And there's a recognition that this approach to the questions of how we should live is one that of necessity produces diversity. This is another theme that recurs in humanist discussions of how we should live well, what a good life would be. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. It is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. That view of personal development, the development of the whole person as being an almost organic process, is a very powerful image, I think, and one that certainly, though it's dominant from the 19th century onwards, when the borrowing of this imagery becomes more widespread because of wider public education about science and scientific metaphor, it certainly persists in pre-scientific cultures and literature too. So the pursuit of happiness, which not only is to be explained in terms of pleasure, but also is to be explained in terms of personal development, the sort of diversity of personal development that implies, both very important humanist contributions to the question of how to live. A second general category of responses to the question of what makes a good life is the idea of connections. These are 3 examples of the idea of connections to other human beings. Of all the ingredients of a happy life, says Epicurus, friendship is the greatest. Only connect, says E.M. Forster 2,000 years later, talking in his novel of the connections between people across boundaries of all sorts. Remember your humanity and forget the rest, says Bertrand Russell at about the same time. All these are examples of the humanist view that connections with other people, relationships with other human beings, are part of the thing that gives colour and warmth to life, an essential ingredient when we're trying to consider what the best way to live is. A human person doesn't exist in isolation, but in community with others. It's not just connections with individual human beings in front of you right now that have been seen as important on this view. All sorts of other connections as well, beyond our connections with the others who are our companions on the journey of life. Humanists of various sorts have urged us to realise and develop connections with the broader human story. Nigel Warburton, one humanist philosopher, points out that we can even make use of inanimate objects in our fulfillment of this desire. Think of how we value objects, he says, that have been in touch with people now dead over indistinguishable tokens of the same type. A pen that belonged to a favourite uncle or a grandmother's wedding ring. The object's particular histories do not usually leave their traces on the objects, yet we treat them as if they had done. So not just personal connections with the real people we find ourselves in contact with, but imaginative connections with other human beings who are not directly there in front of us. This is one of the ways in which fulfillment can be reached, developing that sense of connectedness with people, even in that category. And this can go further. Other people would push this further and say not just with men and women who through these objects we might have some sort of even notional relationship, but even through a sense of trying to develop a sense of the generations of people who have gone before us and the generations that hopefully will stretch in front of us, through more of a knowledge about their ways, through an imaginative positioning of ourselves in that great chain or that tree of life. Another way to feel connectedness and give life a sense of meaning. Not just with other human beings, in person or imaginatively, but also with the rest of the natural world. We can feel that connectedness, that sense of connection with other parts of reality, not just with the human parts. Here's a nice bit of Richard Dawkins. Why, when you go to the Grand Canyon and you see the strata of geological time laid out before you, why is there a feeling that brings you close to tears? Or looking at images from the Hubble telescope. The human mind is big enough and imaginative enough to be poetically moved by the whole sweep of geological ages represented by the rocks that you are standing among. That's why you feel in awe. And in the chapter that this is taken from a book called Is Nothing Sacred, which is a collection of essays by members of the British Humanist Association on this theme, he also talks about giant redwoods and the first human fossils and other sorts of aspects of the natural world that give you that feeling of connectedness, that take you outside of yourself in profound experiences that give a certain richness to life. Many other dimensions of human life and experience give similar scope for fulfillment and personal development, and there are as many such occupations as there are human beings, more than there are time to discuss this evening. Quite reasonably, scholars of humanism, Janine Fowler is one such, is not a humanist writer herself, but as it were, an analyst of humanism. She wrote a textbook about humanism for higher education. Quite reasonably, scholars of humanism have characterized humanist views about meaning in life and the good life and a meaningful life as optimistic sort of views. You are what you make of yourselves, says Janine. Aim high, aim for the stars, and you may yet clear the rooftops. You will need courage, tenacity, motivation, and a good sense of humour on the route. Quality of character, happiness, fulfilment of potential, and of human needs can be improved through changed values, through redirection of individual life, by a process of personal change and personal evolution. And this sort of optimistic attitude, the optimistic dimension to humanist answers to the question of what the meaning in our life can be, give rise sometimes to charges of a certain naivety, which sometimes isn't connected to the tragic view that I laid out at the beginning of my talk. But I don't think this is a naive approach. I think it is actually a good way to live. No journey is ever successful if you begin it, expecting the worst, and in fact you make success much more likely if you set out with a certain determination. Can't really see what's wrong with optimism in that sense. There was an International Humanist Congress actually once in this very room in 2009, bringing humanists from all sorts of organisations across the world, and I was particularly struck by a group of Ugandan humanists, obviously operating in an extremely hostile environment to promote their views and the sort of work that they do. They talked about the sort of social action projects that they were involved in. They help set up girls' football teams. They help to set up schools, secular schools, humanist schools, where children can receive a balanced education, children who wouldn't receive any education at all. They set up refuges for women who've been forced into various sorts of sex work to teach them a trade and to improve their lives and their chances. And I was particularly struck by what they described as their motivation for all that work. What was it that had set them on the path of doing all those amazing things in such challenging environments? And it simply was the sort of optimism that their humanist view engendered. The idea that with the absence of any sort of help from without human beings, it was ordinary men and women who had the power to take into their own hands their destinies, perhaps to a limited extent constrained by unfortunate circumstances though they might be. Nonetheless, they had an optimism that forced them to make a change. So I think it's a good thing to resist critics of optimism quite often. I think optimism can make the world a better place. In fact, it's probably the only thing that does. Nonetheless, some people say this is a delusion. Ultimately, on the humanist view, they say, we will come to nothing. Everyone we ever knew will come to nothing. Everyone yet to be will come to nothing. And so will everything that we do and create. Well, humanists, in fact, know this more so than others, if anything, not believing in any sort of future state. We know that from this ultimate perspective, everything we do is the rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic, in the proverbial sense, from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. But I think what the humanist does further is to ask if it really makes sense to talk of ultimately in our lives and in those terms. Ian Forster speaks about this, the great humanist novelist of the early 20th century, when he talks about humanism covering his main belief in the individual and in his duty to create and to understand and to contact other individuals, a duty that may be and ought to be a delight. The human race to which he belongs may not survive, but that should not deter him. Wherever our race comes from, wherever it is going to, whatever his own fissures and weaknesses, he himself is here, is now. He must understand, create, contact. Humanism and a humanist approach to the question of what a good life is a call to take our real existence in the here and now seriously, to focus on it, to really make the most of it, and to help others to do the same. It's a dynamic call to living the good life as an alternative to antique notions of a capital M meaning in life. I think it's all the better for that. And here's a picture of a frog. Thank you very much.
And if you have any questions, we do have time for a few questions.
Andrew,
Hello.
When you're dead, what do you hope your legacy will be in 1 million years' time?
1 billion, did you say?
Just 1 million.
Oh, just 1 million. Oh, well. Well, I think that's exactly the sort of question that is almost not worth asking or answering, as I was trying to say at the very end. I think the compound discount on on the value of something that is going to happen 1 million years from now, to me, renders it pretty nugatory in the sense of
part of the greater organism.
Yes. Well, I just don't. I do you feel that way? I mean, it's an interesting point of view, which I don't. It doesn't resonate personally with me. I mean, I'd like to think, of course, that 1 million years from now, human beings will be living in a Star Trek or post-Babylon 5 sort of existence, where we've spread out across the known universe and living the secular humanist utopian dream, like in all of that sort of science fiction. But I doubt it very much. And I also, I think, struggle to find relevance and a sense of purpose in things that will happen so long from now and from my own life. Even sentimentally, I mean, I can't even feel an imaginative affinity with that sort of future. I think I can lose myself in stories of that sort and entertain sort of with science fiction and so on. I feel a much stronger affinity with the past than with the future, personally. But that's just one of those things that people have different views on.
If the meaning of human life is to lead a good life, what's the meaning of animal life, including frogs, of course?
No, I don't think the meaning of human life is to live a good life. I mean, I think there is no meaning to human life in that sense. I think the whole question of any question that says what is the meaning of human life, I think is a non-question. That's why I would prefer to change the question to how can we feel a sense of meaning in our lives, or even better question, as I said, what is a good way to live? What is the or a good way to live? Meaning, in the sense that that phrase has been used in the past, really implies purpose. It implies plan and design. It implies that there is an intention behind not just our own appearance as a species, but in other aspects of the universe as well. And I just don't think there's any discernible trace of that in the reality that we find ourselves in. So I think that the right question to ask in the absence of an answer to that question is instead, how shall we live? What shall I do with my time here, given all these...
I find even card-carrying atheists get quite upset if you say there is no meaning to life.
Well, if people get upset when you say there is no meaning to life, I mean, that's their problem. I think it is... you might be married to, oh, that's your problem. But I think it is a problem that you can solve together. Well, I think, so let's say that then. Talking to someone who says something like that, says, how can you say it's all for nothing? How can you say there is no meaning? Say, well, I think that when the average person thinks about meaning in life, what they're really saying is, what is my existence for? What is the existence of other people that I find myself on this journey with for? Now, if you don't believe that there is some ultimate and eventual purpose for the whole of humanity, you have to ground questions like that, questions of what my time here is for, what the time of other people is for, in what we know. And what we definitely know is that we have one life, that we share our lives with other human beings and with other animals and with other parts of the natural world. And so let's spend some time thinking about what the right thing to do in that life is and what the best way of living in that life is. So I'd still try and repose the question, but hopefully in a gentle way that didn't provoke agony. Because some people, I mean, it's an honest aversion, isn't it? People do have it. And if you've got a sense that life has meaning and purpose, and, the structure that you've given it in your mind is that this is so, and that everything is for something, well, of course, it's terrible bereavement to have that sense taken away. And so I think it's a fair question as to whether or not one should seek to take it away from people. I mean, there are degrees. If my great-great-grandmother... she's obviously dead. I'm trying to think of someone living. If my grandmother were to say to me, 3 hours from death, look up into my eyes and say, oh, you do believe that it was all for something, isn't it? I am going to heaven or something, there is a purpose. Then I would obviously say, yes, Grandma, absolutely. Right? You would have to, well, don't shake your head. I mean, would you say no? Well, I think that would be inhumane. I think you have to... You said no. Was she 3 hours from death?
No, 3 weeks.
3 hours, 3 weeks. Well, that's where you have to have this conversation about questions of degree. I mean, if someone is 6 years old, I think I would probably take the time and take the trouble and take the risk to have a serious conversation with them. Thankfully, my grandmother is a humanist. So it's unlikely to arise in practice. But I think you have to just deal with these situations in the contexts that you approach them. There's no single rule, I think, for how you deal with these situations. Ask yourself a question of what the right thing to do is. What will be gained by this discussion or by changing this person's mind? Is the truth itself and someone's acceptance of the truth so valuable a thing to me that it allows me to tyrannize over other people's feelings in the sort of extreme circumstances of deathbeds? Or if not, what other circumstances should I, try and argue my point or whatever? But these are questions of courtesy as much as they're questions of deep thought.
Time?
Do you want to hear something now about actual amphibians and things? Or no,
no, sorry, it wasn't about amphibians, but it struck me with what you were saying was lots of the things were simply sort of assertions from a position of authority or some famous person or your own personal view. And without necessarily any sort of concrete proof that this would be the right way to lead a good life, it just seems like it's the right sort of thing to you. And that strikes me as quite a sort of religious attitude. Just saying, well, we think this is a good way of doing things, it seems right to us, is without actually seeking any proof that that's the case, seems to me equivalent to Christianity or Islam or something.
In what way? In those examples, a religion like Islam doesn't say this just seems to us to be the best way. It says this is the way because it is mandated by a God that definitely exists.
Well,
and there is a single meaning of life.
But
so it's not quite analogous. But maybe there is a way which it is, but I don't understand your question.
Well, I guess the reason it's analogous is that people take the religion, start to believe in a particular religion because it makes sense to them in some way. And then they can go ahead believing what they are told because it fits within that framework and it feels right. And in the absence of any proof, that's the case. And it struck me that quite a lot of your statements came under that same umbrella, which I find slightly disconcerting. I'm quite happy for there to be no meaning of life.
Yes, I agree with you.
Look for one.
I think there is no meaning of life. I agree with that, absolutely.
But lots of the ways in which you said this seems like a good way to lead the good life, to connect to people, for example. Well, that's just a feature of the way that human personality works. And there might be some way of proving that might make you happier, but instead it seemed like you were sort of asserting this from a position of authority rather than from a position of any proof.
Fine. I think that's an artifact of the way in which I presented it, which was to use illustrative quotes from people that other people would have heard of in order to make the general point. I'm not saying John Stuart Mill has said this and therefore it is true. I'm saying here is an example of this view that is discernible in the humanist tradition of thinking about these things. It's a nicely worded example that I happen to like, and so I'm sharing it with you. These things obviously are not authorities in the sense that what they say is the case. I agree with the premise behind your question, that this is not the basis for a prescriptive recipe of how to live. These are examples from a certain way, a certain human tradition of thinking about questions of how we ought to live, what we ought to do, what is conducive to the common good to do, what is conducive to individual sense of fulfillment to do. These are examples from one particular intellectual tradition of answers to those questions.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we do have to move on.
Earnest attempts are made, obviously, scientifically and social scientifically, to try and establish perhaps those sorts of requirements. Famous hierarchies of human needs, psychological and otherwise. And certainly I don't think there's anything in which I say be incompatible with those. It's just a different type of approach. Oh, well, thank you very much.